Hello and welcome to today's video. It is on chemical pathways and keystone species. But before we get into it, check this out.
This is an archway, and this is the cornerstone or keystone. In architecture, when the keystone is removed, everything else crumbles. The Bible speaks about this in Isaiah 28 verse 16. So this is what the sovereign Lord says. See, I lay a stone in Zion, a tested stone, a precious cornerstone for a sure foundation. The one who relies on it will never be stricken with panic. Essentially saying that without Jesus as the cornerstone in our life, everything crumbles. Think in biology, what does this stone refer to?
Welcome back. The purpose of today's lesson is to talk about how matter cycles through ecosystems. We will look at the water, carbon, and nitrogen cycles, as well as discuss keystone species and analyze data. So, biogeochemical cycles. This is an image of a man named George Rhodes. He created this kinetic sculpture whereby it lifts up and moves around billiard balls. And it's this illustration of how nutrients that are essential for life pass through abiotic and biotic components of an ecosystem. Bio refers to life, geo earth, and chemical processes that allow this to happen. The nutrients that are essential for life can be remembered in this mnemonic, SNOPS, whereby the C stands for carbon. We have hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur as well. Hydrogen and oxygen. So water is essential for life as it makes up most of our body, and oxygen is needed in the process of cellular respiration, of breaking down sugars to produce energy. Carbon makes up the macromolecules that make us up, and nitrogen is essential in the formation of proteins. First cycle we will look at is the water cycle. So we need to think about, in each of these cases, how do we obtain this source from the environment? Also think about, where is the reservoir pool in this case? Where is most of that source contained? So water is obtained from plants through their roots and their leaves. We can simply drink the water. It moves through the abiotic components of the environment through evaporation from oceans, lakes, and streams, as well as through evapotranspiration from the leaves of plants. The water moves from a fluid to a gas in the process of condensation, and then comes down again in the form of precipitation. The reservoir being the oceans, lakes, and streams. We then have the carbon cycle. So carbon is obtained from the atmosphere through photosynthesis. The plants take carbon in. Animals can then gather that carbon through eating plants, or we can eat the animals that eat the plants, or eat the plants themselves to obtain carbon ourselves. How does that carbon get back into the atmosphere? Well, it's through the process of cellular respiration, whereby we exhale and breathe out carbon dioxide. Carbon is also released back into the atmosphere from stored carbon sources underground, such as fossils, through the process of combustion. The reservoir for carbon can be in the trees. It can also be underground in the fossils. If too much carbon is being taken out of those areas and released into the atmosphere, it can put an imbalance into our environment, and that's what we are seeing with climate change. Lastly, the nitrogen cycle. So where is the reservoir? Well, 78% of air that we breathe is actually nitrogen. So nitrogen is obtained from the atmosphere by bacteria in a process called nitrogen fixation. There's bacteria in soils and on the roots of plants that convert this nitrogen into the form of ammonia. Ammonia can then be further used by plants, but also further converted into nitrites and nitrates, other forms. And this process is done through nitrifying bacteria. But how does that nitrogen get back into the atmosphere? Well, we have other bacteria called denitrifying bacteria, which convert it from these nitrates back into nitrogen, which goes into the atmosphere. Keystone species. We'll start with a definition. A keystone species is a plant or animal with a disproportional effect on the ecosystem relative to its abundance. So it has a big effect based on a small number of species. It can theoretically be positive or negative. If we look at an archway, the keystone or cornerstone is that piece that holds everything together. Without it, everything else crumbles. So keep that thought process in mind as we talk about species now. This term was coined by an American ecologist called Robert Payne, and he studied throwing starfish back into the water off a particular habitat and how that had a massive effect on what was going on there. After about a year, he saw biodiversity begin to increase. The number of species diminished, and several years later, he saw that it essentially became a monoculture of mussels on a rock. So when one species was removed, it had a huge effect on every other species. This is what a keystone is. We can see that throughout the world, there are different species that have large effects. So the grey wolves in Yellowstone National Park. There's a cool video in the link which shows how wolves can actually affect the course of rivers. So check that out. Then there's beavers, and beavers create dams, and the flow of water is affected there by affecting every other species down the river. But if we think more locally, we have the parrotfish in the Great Barrier Reef, named after its hard beak-like structure that it uses to peel algae off of coral, which would otherwise smother the coral and kill it, thereby damaging the home of many species that live in that environment. There's also otters as well, and there's a cool David Attenborough documentary that talks about otters and kelp. So that's what a keystone species is. Let's get into some questions. Within the nitrogen cycle, the transformation of nitrates into nitrogen gas is called A, B, C, or D. You can pause the video here, flick back over the slides that we've covered, and come up with your answer. Hopefully you have answered by now. I'm going to go through the answers in this video as well. So it is B. This is again taken from the QCAA stimulus, and it says identify 2 roles that keystone species play in maintaining the structure of a community. So think back to the definition of what makes a keystone species and that should help you answer this question. I hope that you've been able to come up with some thoughts by now and have something similar to this. So for 1 mark, they maintain biodiversity. If you think back to Robert Payne's example of removing the starfish, it reduced biodiversity to essentially a monoculture of mussels. Secondly, they control populations. They keep that ecological balance in check. Some other thoughts you might have had is that keystone species, they provide critical resources for a wide range of species. We will look at that more in the next question. And again, they maintain balance. So 2 marks, 2 points. This is an interaction map, and it shows a food web of biota in Australian rainforests. It's most likely up in the northern rainforest because we see the casserole here. If you just look at this map, which of these species do you think is the keystone? I hope that you might have seen that all the producers here actually feed in to the southern casserole here. So as we go about these next few questions, think about, okay, what role does the southern casserole have? What service does it provide to this ecosystem, this most likely simplified version of the real ecosystem, as we think about these next questions? So we've already spoken that, yes, the cassowary is the keystone species. because of the impact that it has on the rest of the ecosystem. So let's talk about that a bit more. But firstly, have a go answering these questions first. So pause the video here. Cool. I hope you've had some time. So question B, predict the outcome for the ecosystem of removing the keystone species. If we removed the cassowary, what would happen to this ecosystem? What would happen to these plants, these producers? Well, the ecosystem will collapse in the case of a keystone being removed. And think about those producers. The seeds of fruit trees are not dispersed, and all other organisms in the ecosystem rely on fruit trees. So the cassowary eats the fruit trees, and then the seeds are digested and dispersed. The next question is this. So there were 2 marks there, one for saying it will collapse and the second one for saying why. If this rainforest habitat was to become fragmented, identify which mechanism of isolation would mostly influence gene flow. So the answer for this, we've spoken briefly about one type of isolation, and that was geographical. So that is the type of isolation that would affect species the most. Species which are separated geographically may find it difficult to breed, thus reducing gene flow. Also, species which are separated geographically may have reduced fitness and also, just like, the ability to reproduce. So there's a few marks in there. I encourage you guys to study these questions and answers that we go over as well. Lastly, this is not a question taken from QCAA, but rather from our boy, Dr. G. And the question is this: the stars on the map below show the distribution of the keystone fig tree species, Ficus rubiginosa, in the study area. And the graph further below shows the abundance of ripening fruit in these fig trees, how they influence the frugivorous and insectivorous birds. So birds that eat fruit, birds that eat insects, interacting with the tree. So we can see from this map, there's a few stars here representing this fig tree. We can also see that this graph has the time that different birds spend at the tree along the number of ripening fruit. So let's look at some questions. From this information, explain why this fig is classified as a keystone species. Again, think back to the definition in your response. Next question is predict the outcomes of removing this species from its ecosystem. So have a pause and a think here. Look at this map for this question. Look at this graph for this question. And we'll go through it together. Okay, I hope that you've had some time with that now. So why is it a keystone species to begin with? Well, 2 marks, 2 points. It has a small abundance. There's not many stars on the map, but it would no doubt provide important services. So whether that's food or whether it's shade and shelter for other birds. So we can see that there are birds coming to this place, whether that's to eat or just to eat the fruit or eat the insects. Next question is predict the outcomes of removing this species. So we know that if a keystone is removed, well, the ecosystem will most likely collapse. So let's talk about what would happen for each of these species. For the insectivores, these birds, there is a consistent interaction with these birds regardless of the fruit. So see, the fruit is going up, but there's still a consistent interaction. So they are most likely going to decline without these trees. That's probably where they get their food source, their insects, which are finding shelter in these trees. But what about the frugivores? So it may not affect the frugivores in the same way, as there is a small abundance of trees anyway, and they are likely fruiting seasonally. And frugivores should depend on other food sources too. So that is that. Again, have a think over those answers if you would like to spend more time on them. And this is the particular plant species, maybe you've seen them, that we're talking about. And that is all for today, and I will leave you with this cute picture of the northern quoll. It is the smallest of these quoll species that we have here. However, as cute as they are, they're actually under significant threat for different reasons, due to fires, due to grazing, due to cane toads and feral cats. And the whole reason why we study keystone species and ecology is to better maintain the survival of the species that we do have left. Guys, God bless, and I'll see you soon.